We basically discovered how immunological surveillance works. This is a phenomenon where you have white blood cells, the lymphocytes, and among those white blood cells, you have different subsets, categories, and some of them invade and travel through tissues as well, and then go back into the bloodstream via the lymph. The particular cells we were interested in were called the CD8 T cells or killer T cells. And these are cells that actually are programmed to turn on when they're stimulated and kill other cells to get rid of them, because what happens in us, our cells can go wrong. They can go wrong through a mutation and become cancerous. And one of the ways they can be got rid of is if these killer T cells recognize their change and they bump them off.
All right, you're listening to Hawk Talk. I'm here today with Professor Peter Doherty. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. Thanks for coming on. So, got to kick it off. I'm guessing you're, the day you're born, you're in the delivery room, and you immediately go, "We've got to fix all the processes at this hospital. We've got to figure out how to increase my immune system." Like you're just from the beginning, just dove right into immunology. Fair?
No, not at all. Not at all.
All right. Well, let's take it from the top. Where are you originally from?
I'm from Brisbane, Australia.
Nice.
That's where I grew up.
Yeah. Talk about the early days. Were your parents scientists? Like, were you around sciences a lot, or what was childhood like?
I was growing up in the great state of Queensland, which is the northern state. So it's like being in the southern United States because everything's upside down in Australia. And my parents have both left school at age 15, which was pretty common for that time. And I grew up in a sort of lower middle class, working class suburb, outer suburb of the city of Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland.
Yep.
Which goes right up. It becomes equatorial in the north and almost touches Papua New Guinea. My generation, which included three cousins, was the first generation that went to university. So a bit unlike the United States, where a lot of people have parents and even grandparents who are university trained.
And what kind of things were you into as a kid? What were your interests?
Well, like every kid, trying to be good at sport, being absolutely hopeless, skinny kid with very fair complexion in a state which had a lot of sunlight and a lot of UV, and sunblocks weren't invented at that time. So, and as a result, I'd probably read a lot more than most other kids and was a bit more indoors. And growing up, the gift my mother gave me is she was a classical music teacher. So she didn't like to teach much, but she played music all the time. So I grew up with the classical repertoire on the piano.
And did you played piano as well?
No. As soon as I started to learn, as soon as I said, like every kid, "Oh, I don't want to do this," she said, "Great," because she hated teaching.
Yeah. Perfect. And so we're like, every kid has this, "I want to be this when I grow up." And when you were like 5, 6, 7, 8, like what was that thing for you?
I think I just wanted to survive, actually. It was a kind of tough place.
Fair enough. And so tell me more. Okay, so as you progressed high school, tell me more about like where were your interests? Were you still like very much into books? Were you still pursuing sports? How were you as a teenager?
I was into books, played a bit of tennis, even played a bit of basketball, but not with any distinction. I was a year younger than most of the kids in the class. For some reason, they bumped a lot of us up a year early on because of the baby boom coming after World War II. I was born in 1940, so I'm a World War II baby. So I was young, I was skinny, and I was anyway. I was uncoordinated. I wasn't one of the. I was one of those boys that really their myelin tracks to get their act together late. So I was never much good at any of that. The best thing I discovered was squash, because you could play that inside. You never got sunburnt. You could bang the ball into the wall and it came back. It was really a real revelation. And at high school, my best subject, I was doing all the sciences, but my best subject was English and French, and I loved history. I've always been in love with history. So I was good at the sciences, but when it came to going to university, I decided I needed to do something practical. I'd been reading Ernest Hemingway and also Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Aldous Huxley. So I was a very confused kid, actually, and I decided I should be the man of action. So I decided to become a veterinarian, because Queensland was a big agricultural state, and that's where the kind of romantic stories about Queensland are. Like Texas. A lot of people live in big cities, but the Texan we all envisage has got a big 10-gallon hat and riding boots and so forth. And it was a bit like that. So I wanted an adventure. Uh, a totally dumb choice, but it worked out okay in the end.
So, and did you have a love for animals, or was it more like what was it that drew you to veterinary practices?
I was very interested in saving the world. I'd had a sort of religious upbringing, a bit religious, from my grandmother more than my parents, and Methodism. And Methodism in Australia, at least, was a religion that was very much dedicated to never making any money, being involved in social service. And they disapproved of drinking, totally disapproved of drinking, because it was a reformist movement to
Yep.
combat alcoholism back in the 19th century. And they didn't approve of dancing either. So no drinking, no dancing. And
Wow.
it was a bit miserable, but I didn't stay embedded in that. But I wanted to save the world, basically, and do good things. And so I decided I was going to improve food production by doing research in animal diseases. I had a cousin who was a medical researcher.
Yeah, it's relevant. I mean, in the U.S. right now, it's so relevant with the egg prices because we've had such bad problems with bird flu. Like, it's interesting that how relevant that is, and that's interesting. I mean, I think if you polled 100 people that got into veterinary practices, whether they did it to because they loved animals or they wanted to help with food production, I think you'd probably have 99% of them would swing the other way. So
I'd say
it's an interesting thought.
99.9.
Yeah, yeah,
But it was different back then. And also, people who go into veterinary medicine in the United States have already done a 4-year college degree. At
right.
that stage, that's true now in Australia as well. But at that stage, you went straight into the professional classes, medicine, dentistry, and so forth, straight out of high school. So I just turned 17 when I started veterinary
Wow.
science, and I finished at the age of 22. I spent a bit of time as a field veterinarian, and but then was in the laboratory as a diagnostic veterinary pathologist and doing some research, and then moved on from there to take myself off to Edinburgh with a new wife and Penny, and became a veterinary neuropathologist and did
Wow.
research and did a PhD through Edinburgh University.
So I'm curious, with both the original pathology studies, were you studying specific diseases or was it just kind of general studies?
I was particularly focused on infectious diseases. I'd started working on a disease called bovine leptospirosis, which is a kidney disease, and in cattle. That was in Australia. And then when I went to Edinburgh, I worked on a virus, encephalitis, tick-borne encephalitis virus, called Lauchingel virus. It's related to European tick-borne encephalitis viruses, more distantly related to yellow fever virus, West Nile virus, those viruses. And I was studying brain pathology and this disease for a PhD thesis as well, working full time
And were you
while I
studying
was
that
doing it.
in humans or specific
No,
types
no,
of
sheep. I was working
in
sheep.
sheep? Got it.
So I'd
Okay.
worked previously with cattle, pigs, chicken,
Yeah.
sheep, and then a bit of stuff with laboratory animals, mice and hamsters, and then we decided to come back to Australia, and I went to the John Curtin School of Medical Research in Canberra, which is a basic biomedical research institute founded after the Second World War, and there, I went there because I wanted to learn more about cell-mediated immunity, cellular immunity, T cells, killer T cells, and this stuff. Before I went on to back to the veterinary world, and I would have joined the big government research organisation called the CSIRO, Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation, as a veterinary virologist pathologist. But we made a big discovery when I was in the John Curtin School working with a young Swiss guy called Rolf Zinkernagel. I was only going to be there for 2 years. I was there for about 3.5. We made this very big discovery in basic biomedical research. And from that time on, I was an MD, a mouse doctor, studying the immune response.
And so what was that big discovery?
We basically discovered how immunological surveillance works. This is a phenomenon where you have white blood cells, the lymphocytes, And among those white blood cells, you have different subsets and categories. And these are the white cells that go round and round in the body. And some of them invade and travel through tissues as well, and then go back into the bloodstream via the lymph. And the particular cells we were interested in were called the CD8 T cells, or killer T cells. And these are cells that actually are programmed to turn on when they're stimulated and kill other cells to get rid of them. Because what happens in us, our cells can go wrong. They can go wrong through a mutation and become cancerous. And one of the ways they can be got rid of is if these killer T cells recognize their change and they bump them off. And the other thing is with virus infections, viruses are bits of nucleic acid, DNA or RNA, clad in protein. They can't multiply themselves. They have to get into cells, our cells or cells of other animals or insects even, and multiply there. So they take over our cell machinery. So what the killer T cells have to do is kill off the cells that are infected, because these are like factories, and they're, one or two virus particles can get in and a million come out. So you can't end the infection until you clear that out. And so this is what we call immune surveillance. It's white blood cells, killer T cells, checking out the surface of other cells to see if they've gone wrong. And then if they haven't, turning on to kill them. And that's a very powerful phenomenon. And so we kind of discovered that was targeted onto the cell surface by recognizing modifications of what we call the transplantation molecules, the transplantation antigens that are recognized in graft rejection when we graft a kidney across to someone else. So it was a kind of revolutionary discovery, because it turned things on their head, because everyone thought, well, the immune system reacts against foreign transplantation antigens on, say, a foreign kidney or a foreign heart. But here we were saying, well, basically our own cells are monitoring our own transplantation molecules to see if they've been changed. And basically it's an immune surveillance mechanism. So it was hard to get across to people to start with, immunologists particularly, because they've been used to thinking in exactly the opposite way.
So on that note, I mean, that's got to be the reason why not all of us are covered in cancer versus, sometimes it gets out of hand, but I got to imagine these
Yeah,
cells are
yeah. Well,
killing
that's
people.
one of the reasons. I mean, another reason we're not all covered in cancer is cells are normally programmed to kill themselves if they go wrong, and
Oh,
cells are dying all the time in us.
yeah.
There's a constant process of cell turnover and renewal.
Yeah.
Not some cells, the brain cells, the neurons don't do that, but
Yep.
most of our cells in the gut, cells in the blood system, anything, if they go wrong, they'd normally kill themselves. But what can happen with them is a mutation happens, and they no longer kill themselves. That's one reason they become cancerous. But then we still need something to eliminate them. And these new treatments for cancer, where you give what's called an immune checkpoint inhibitor, these actually turn on cells that are cancer specific but have been turned off by the cancer, which is cancers are very able to do. And they turn on, you give these what they call monoclonal antibodies, the cells in the cancer will turn on to kill it. And the guy called Jim Allison and Tasuku Honjo both got a Nobel Prize for that a few years back, and it's become a very powerful treatment.
Got it. And so you said you spent 3.5 years working on this. What caused you to leave?
Well, there wasn't really a job for me. Australia is kind of small in population sense. In the land sense, it's the same size as the contiguous United States, but a lot of it's a very dry and arid country. And even now, we only have a population of 25 million people, 26 million, I think it is, in an area that's got about 300 million Americans, for instance. I mean, you take away Alaska and Hawaii, and that's the same size as Australia. You can fit Texas into it multiple times. And so there's not that much opportunity. So I then went to Philadelphia to the Wistar Institute, which is in the grounds of the University of Pennsylvania, but is an independent research institute. In fact, America's oldest private biomedical research institute, set up in the 1890s, 1880s, something like that. And it's also, I was also a kind of an adjunct professor at University of Pennsylvania and had students and so forth through that. So I was there for 7 years. It was great. I loved
Nice.
it.
And
Lived
what
out
drew
on
you out
Main
there?
Line.
Was it to teach or was it to continue
No
some sort of
research. I was a researcher. It was a research institute. I've never really been a university teacher. I'm a
Yeah.
researcher.
Yeah. And what were you researching there?
I was working on influenza. I started to work on influenza
Interesting.
because a good colleague there was a good influenza virologist, and I like to work with a virologist who knows what they're doing. And he also was an immunologist, so we worked together. He worked on what was called the antibody side of things, the B cells we talk about, and I worked on the T cell side of things, the killer T cells. And we made another important discovery that the killer T cells are much more cross-reactive than the antibodies, which are the means the immune part of the immune system we stimulate that basically is the main part of the immune component that gives us vaccine protection and gives us antibodies circulating in the blood that will grab onto a newly invaded virus and stop it.
So you're saying the T cells are more activated. What does that
They're
mean?
much more cross-reactive. So the T cells, the killer T cells that would infect, say, an influenza type, will also see cells infected with multiple types of flu because they're recognizing components of the virus that come from internal proteins of the virus, which are quite conserved. And so they're a much more cross-reactive response. And there's a lot of thought about trying to make T cell vaccines. We still think about it a bit as an add-on to the antibody ones. A lot of effort went into trying to make T cell vaccines against AIDS, but it didn't work because the problem was once the AIDS virus in, it's away and it copies itself back into the genome and you can't get rid of it. Not by immunological means, anyway.
And yeah, I'm curious, like if T cells are, sort of, it sounds like more protective, more aggressive. Is there a way to stimulate that? Is there like, have you guys
Yeah,
discovered ways?
yeah, you
Yeah.
can. Well, you can't really leave them sitting around stimulated because they actually produce nasty stuff that's also involved in trying to cure the infection. So you want them to act, and then you want them to die back. But you have what is called immunological memory. That is, you get a quicker response the next time round, and you get what are called memory cells. But they've gone back to being quiescent. It takes about at least 3 to 5 days to turn them on again, an immune response. So they're not immediately available. And so they can help with a virus that doesn't establish some sort of permanent presence. You've got that problem with HIV, it establishes a permanent presence. But they're fine, they help with influenza, for instance, but they come on late. So they don't stop you maybe getting a little bit sick, but they hopefully stop you getting very sick.
Yeah, got it. And
Mm.
all right, and so you spent 7 years in Pennsylvania. What happened after that?
We went back to Australia to the National University where I'd done that work. I went back as a department head. For one reason or another, that didn't work out very well. So I came back to the United States to the head of the Department of Immunology at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. Again, a wonderful private institution, of course, very well known within the United States with enormous fundraising for kids'
I
cancer.
say, yeah,
So
I've attended and donated a few times to some of their
yes, yes,
fundraising.
yes. Many Americans donate, and it shows the enormous generosity of the American people. And we have, people with not much money supporting it through things like bikeathons and
Yeah.
trichathons and runs and things, to millionaires and billionaires who have provided very generous support. So it's one of the great things about America. We see this. I mean, they raise more than $1 billion a year in private
Wow,
donation. They're a wonderful
that's amazing.
organization and they're
And you
great
went
to
in
work
there,
with.
and you
But
said you
it's
went
in
in there as the
Memphis,
head of.
so
Yeah,
mhm.
fair. But you went in there as the head of immunology. You said.
Yeah, that's right. I was head of immunology, and that's when I was there, we got the Nobel Prize basically for the work the discovery we'd made back in Canberra as young guys, and by then I was in my 50s, and so that was the first Nobel Prize for St Jude. I think it was maybe the second or third Nobel Prize for Tennessee. I mean, William Faulkner, and there was also a medical scientist in Vanderbilt who got him a Nobel Prize.
Uh-huh. And
And
so you how long before that was a discovery when you were in
the
when you
discovery was 22 years earlier. That's
okay.
pretty normal, actually, for a Nobel
I was going to
Prize.
ask. Yeah. So
Yeah,
you make a
20.
discovery, they is it because they want it validated and they want to make sure that
Well,
you're
it took a while to really get it sorted out. It took another 10 years before what we said was happening was actually shown to be true. And that was mostly done by other people. We were using the discovery to study the immune response, but they were trying to study the recognition events. And they had different technologies and different expertise. And it was worked out by several different people. who discovered that, how it actually works at a molecular level, and that convinced everybody, and it became just part of the background of immunology. So that's what happens in science when you make a big discovery. There's a bit of fuss about it for a time, and there may be quite a bit of controversy, as there was with our discovery. But then it becomes what's called incorporated. It just becomes part of the science, and people forget who did it and why, and so forth. And so you just become part of the story. And so you get mentioned in textbooks and stuff, and that's about it.
And so tell me about winning a Nobel Prize. Was that something you had aspired to? Was that something that even if you didn't, like, how was that emotionally for you?
No, I'd never aspired to it. I mean, you wouldn't take a course in veterinary science if you wanted to win the Nobel Prize. I'm the only person still with a veterinary training to win any Nobel Prize, actually. So it's quite
That's
quite strange.
amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I mean, there will be more because there are a lot of good scientists who come
yeah.
across into basic medical research from
I
the
mean, even
veterinary
on the
field.
basic levels, I've always had dogs, and our dog is dealing with a minor medical thing right now, but the amount of things they can take and they use that are the same as people, and the similarities in their biology, it's like
Yeah,
it makes
similarities and
sense. Yeah,
differences, but
yeah,
they're no more different from humans than a lab mouse, and of course, a lot of medical research is done in lab mice, and that's what I was doing. But some my sort of successors, people I've trained, and many others who other people who've trained, have got very much now into studying human responses because of the advances in technology have made that a lot easier and a lot more feasible. I was involved in basic biomedical research actively for oh, another 35, even 40 years after 10 years doing veterinary research. And then I gradually got out of it to sort of hand over to the younger people because I think it's important that old guys get out of the way because especially if we're powerful, we can use up a lot of money. And there hasn't been all that much money around. And now with the current administration in the United States, there's going to be less money around. So
yeah,
it's important to give young people a shot because most discoveries are made by people in biomedical science. They're tending to be made by people in their 20s to their 50s. I mean,
why do
in
you think
things
that
like
is?
mathematics and high energy physics, they're made much younger. But
And why do you think that is? Why is it younger people that are making those discoveries?
I think lots of energy, working hard, not too stuck with administrative issues because what happens, success defeats you because you get more administrative roles and you get more. In my case, with the Nobel Prize, you get much bigger public communication role. And I took the public communication role seriously. So since age 65, in fact, I've published 8 books. Um, and I think several of them have been published in the United States, all in Australia, and some of them are on science, aspect of science and the scientific life. I also became very interested in defending the climate change scientists because I'm convinced this is the biggest challenge that's facing us is climate change. And of course, now some people don't actually believe that at all. They didn't want to believe it because it's very inconvenient, but now it's almost forbidden. So which is insane, quite frankly, and very, very, very stupid. But that's the way it is. I also wrote one book on a family story. It's called Empire, War, Tennis, and Me. It's the definitive work on war and tennis because nobody's ever written that book and nobody's ever going to write it again. So
On war in tennis, you're saying?
war and tennis, yeah. So a story of two uncles who were good tennis players made their own tennis court, as Australians did at that time.
Yeah.
They made it out of what's called ant bed, crushed termite mounds. It was
Huh.
a clay court made with crushed termite mounds. Very good for self-weeding because it was full of dead termites and termite toxins and stuff. And so they were pretty good local district court players. And then they both went off to World War II, and one was caught in Malaya and ended up on the Burma Thai Railroad and wrote a lot of letters back, which we discovered, which is part of the trigger for writing the book.
Uh-huh.
And then I never met him as an adult because he died in an Japanese prisoner of war ship that was sunk by an American submarine group.
Oh wow.
They saved some of them later. They came back and they saved some of them. And it was the first, actually, that people knew what was going on in the Japanese prisoner of war camps in Burma and on the Burma Thai Railroad. And then the other one was in all the very worst fighting. He was initially in North Africa, in Syria, but then he was he was on what's called the Kokoda track in Papua New Guinea, which is terrible fighting, and then in clearing out Japanese from East New Guinea, and then in the very last Battle of World War II, which was fought by Australian soldiers at Balikpapan in Borneo, and uh, and so he was an infantry private. So they shot their prisoners early on. The Japanese shot their prisoners.
Yeah.
Very hard to take prisoners in a jungle warfare setting, actually.
Got it. And so what happened to the tennis court?
He played a little bit after he came back, but he lost interest. So I kind of took over the care and maintenance of the tennis courts. So copying Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. I think in my book there's a chapter on the gentle art of tennis court maintenance. So I wrote all about the tennis players who. Lawn tennis really started about 1875. The reason it took so long to get going, they had royal tennis, which you played indoors on a court, a weird game played with balls stuffed with feathers or cork and stuff. But it was a very aristocratic game, and you needed money to play it to be invited to play on these courts. Kings played it, and it's still around. But lawn tennis, firstly, you had to have the invention of vulcanized rubber, which I think Goodyear did. And then you needed lawnmowers. And so until you had vulcanized rubber and lawnmowers, you really couldn't play lawn tennis because leather sole shoes would just tear the court up. And you needed to call a ball that would bounce on lawn. And so it started about 1875. The rules were written originally by what's called the MCC, the Marylebone Cricket Club, because cricket was the only organised sport in Britain, and they had a framework where they could write the rules. And it really, Wimbledon started off, and
Right.
Wimbledon's still the only tennis tournament played on grass, I think. And it
Yeah.
caught on quickly, particularly among upper middle class and aristocratic people. And then got to Australia very early, and Australians started to play it. And the great thing about it is tennis was always played by men and women, though women didn't sort of get in the competitive scene till a bit later, but they were pretty much in the competitive scene by the later part of the 19th century. The people that tended to dominate lawn tennis in the United States early had names like Roosevelt. It was kind of an aristocratic game. But in Australia, because big open spaces, a lot of place to build tennis courts, you could make one fairly easily. It was played by all classes of society, really.
I saw a story recently. I don't know if this is true, but the reason you have green tennis balls now was the first time they televised Wimbledon. You couldn't track the white balls, so they changed them to green. Is that
Yeah, I lost contact with tennis as an actual player, and I was never much good when it was whites and white balls, and it was a very different time.
Yeah, so funny the evolution of that. And so, couple more questions for you. Number one, you've written all these books recently. As you said, you've become a spokesperson. What's next for you? What's coming down the pike? What do you think's in your
Well, I'm
future?
finally retired. I'm 84 years old now, so I'm finally retired, and I've been sorting out my life, which a lot of things I hadn't been dealing with, like getting a decent financial advisor and making we have resource in the United States, resource in Australia, and making Australian and US wills. That's a pain because the legal systems are different and tax rules are different. Tax years are out of sync. Our tax year ends in July, in June, and yours ends in December. So, it's been a constant pain. We came back to Australia in 2002 to work at the University of Melbourne. I'm still associated with the University of Melbourne. I was spending a lot of time on social media through COVID. I was working, even though I was normally working 1 day a week at that stage. I was, 80 years old. Uh, I was I was actually working 6 days a week doing public science communication around COVID because it's right in my area, and doing that across the planet because of the Nobel Prize, I was being asked to comment all over the place.
And what were what are your views? What were your views of like the way COVID was? I don't need to get political to be clear. I'm just more curious from a scientific standpoint, your views on sort of the progress of COVID and where we are now with it.
It's a totally new disease. We haven't had anything like it before, and it's still around, and it's still making people sick, and it's still killing people. But mostly it kills old people or people who've got crap immune systems for one reason or other, genetic reasons or other cancer treatment or something like that. So mostly it's killing old people. It's still doing it, but we kind of ignore it. But the big problem is long COVID, this post viral thing that goes on and on, and there are millions of people who are suffering from long COVID. Most get better in in about 6 months or 1 to 2 years, but not everyone gets better. And it happens with other virus infections too, but not at the same frequency. There was a big influenza outbreak in the late, I think about 1878, 1870, something like that. There was quite a lot of post-viral stuff there. There was quite a bit of post-viral stuff after the 1918-19 influenza virus, which killed 50 or 100 million people, much worse than COVID. I mean, it's in a
Mhm.
population that's about a quarter of the size that it is
Was
now.
that Spanish flu? Is that
That's the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
It's not. It was never Spanish. I mean, it's just that
Yeah, no, yeah.
it was killing the
Nickname.
soldiers on both sides in the trenches in World War One. In fact, it's one of the things that brought World War One to an end. In fact, General
Really?
Ludendorff said it's what, in the end, defeated the Germans. Though I think it
Wow.
was also the Americans. I mean, there were 250,000 fresh American troops coming in every month, and
Yeah,
Germany was pretty exhausted. But
yeah.
it may have started. We don't know where it started. There's different theories. One is that did start in Europe. The other one in France, actually. The other one is that it started in the US and was brought across by American recruits because immensely, very, very high death counts in American military recruit camps. I mean, there are
Got it.
descriptions of corpses being stacked like cords of wood, and and there were heroic. The big heroes of the 1918-19 influenza pandemic were the nurses. Doctors couldn't do much, but nursing was really important.
Just taking
And
care of people while they were sick kind of thing?
yeah, a lot of nurses died. Very
Got it.
interesting, though. No, nothing was written about it. There was one sort of novella called Pale Horse, Pale Rider written. Nothing was written about it at all, pretty much, in the
Huh.
popular literature until the first book was America's Forgotten Pandemic, published in the 1970s. And now there's a lot
Wow.
written about it. A lot of people have gone back and some very nice histories of it, and
Why
they're
do you think
popular.
that is? Was it just something they wanted to sweep under
I
the rug
think
or
I think everyone was totally exhausted by the First World War. There are enormous
Yeah.
numbers of books about the First World War, and also actually people don't really like viruses and pandemics. I mean, this comes out of nature. They're always looking. A lot of people have to have someone to blame. You know, someone has to have done the wrong thing, and we saw that very much through COVID. They were trying to, and Trump triggered it actually, the China virus, and there's always got to be someone to blame. And you can blame someone with wars, and we're used to wars, but we don't like the idea there's stuff out there that's just coming at us, and we don't know if it's coming, and we don't know what to do with it, and we don't like that idea at all.
And during that period with how did you feel about the ability to communicate? And again, I'm just fascinated by this because we all lived through it so recently. Like if you were spending 6 days a week as someone that's one of the foremost experts in immunology and pathology, and you're watching this novel virus, like I'm just fascinated in how that whole experience was for you.
Well, it was fascinating. It looked much more dangerous than it actually was because a lot of early deaths were in that elderly group who weren't protected. And so we got a lot of early deaths in elderly and very unfit people and poor people who just, may have crap diets and lousy fitness, the bus drivers in New York and all that sort of thing. But the young and healthy on the whole weren't getting sick. So they became a bit switched off about all the restrictions on movement stuff. Uh, Early on, that's all we had, is to actually try and keep people apart a bit. And so they were implemented fairly rigorously in Australia. In the US, it varied very, very much from state to state. States like Seattle, Washington State didn't behave all that much differently from some of the Australian states, but states
Yeah.
like Florida and so forth were
Yeah.
much more open.
I mean,
And
California.
they had higher death rates. I won't tell you about it, but they did. They
Yeah.
had a lot more people dying. And
Yeah.
so
California was probably similar to Australia, whereas, yeah,
yeah,
I had friends
California
that
was
were
more
down
like Australia, yeah,
and we had a lot of
and
people in
it's had
California.
lower death rates. Basically, and the vaccines came along. I mean, Trump had the Warp Speed initiative, which Tony Fauci, I guess, talked him into, and I think that brought vaccines on very quickly, and the mRNA vaccines, they're tremendously successful, and they were very successful early on, but then the virus started to change very quickly, and now the virus is always ahead of the vaccine, even if you make a new vaccine. And the vaccines were new. They were new technology. They were tested the same way as any other vaccine. But with vaccines, you test them before you put them out there. Maybe you test them in 20, 30,000, 40,000 people at most. But this is called the phase 3 clinical trial. All that stuff was done properly. But the phase 4 clinical trial is the one that matters when you put it into millions of people, and then you see problems. And there were some problems. There were particularly problems with myocarditis and brain heart inflammation and stuff in adolescent males particularly, not totally adolescent males, but particularly some. I think a small percentage got some permanent long-lasting damage, and a lot more, so quite a few had to go to hospital, but then fully recovered. It was about 1 in 5,000, I think. And then, some of the other vaccines not used in the US, some of them were killing older women with some particular effect. I think a lot of it's to do not the mRNA got blamed. I think a lot of it is actually to do with the spike protein of the COVID virus. But that's probably my next project. I've been neglecting it, and I want to go back and look at the whole thing, read a lot more now that's been published, and I'll probably do a book on maybe something like the long and the short of COVID-19.
I would love to read that.
Because
I
I
have a
want
few
to,
friends.
I need to get
Yeah.
it straight in my own mind. Because some of the things we told people weren't quite right. I think because we didn't understand it, and
Yeah.
yeah,
No, that's how I look at it is like, I think people made the best decision they could with the information you
yeah,
had,
they
which
did the
was
best
very
they
little.
could. And
Yeah.
Fauci was great, and but everyone hates, all the
Well,
cookers
the
hate
issue dealt with
Fauci.
there was the contradiction between Fauci and Trump and then Biden, and like the politicization of this became so bad that, would
Yeah,
it
it became
have
very politicized. It
and
still is.
listen, you just kind of nailed it with like the vaccine had a disproportionate negative effect to young men who, if they had caught COVID, would have probably been totally
Yes,
fine.
yes, and I don't think, you wouldn't advise, but I mean, some healthy young man got long COVID and got quite badly damaged, but it was a minority, and also some little kids got long COVID and they got very sick, and some died, due to other problems they had. So it, and early on, it wasn't being spread by children. I mean, influenza classically often brought into the house by kids who get it at school, but that started to happen later with COVID. So the public health policy, I think there's a lot of thinking to be done about there. And for instance, in Melbourne, Melbourne is we've had a very big immigration program since World War II, and we have a very diverse population with a lot of people from Asia, now from the Middle East, from Africa. The public health response wasn't well set up from the point of view that they didn't have groups who interfaced with immigrant communities and talked the language and so, and that took us a while to learn. Whereas New South Wales, the state to our north, was much better at that. So a lot of lessons there to be learned by the public health communities too. But then what's happening in the US now is making you more vulnerable. They've been cutting public health spending, they're cutting CDC, and it's all part of the monstrous stupidity that's going on. I mean, attacking universities, attacking research, attacking public policy. These are areas where the US has been ahead of China, and now China's going to take that lead. So it's the dumbest administration in American history, I think.
Yeah, well, it's one of those time will tell with all these things, and
Well,
but
I'm
yeah,
very
I
worried.
understood the
I'm
thesis.
very worried
Yeah,
about whether you will have free and fair elections again.
yeah. I thankfully being on the ground, I have less of a fear of that. But in terms of the rest of it, I tend to
Well, it
say,
depends if the basic American values can hold it. I know,
right,
and the Americans I know are great people, and I know a lot of people who in the American South who may well identify with Trump, but as people, they're good people. I mean,
right.
I
And
got to
that's
know
I'm
them.
just to be clear, I'm left leaning kind of centrist, so I'm not
Yeah,
shy about my politics. So,
well,
um,
our country is much more left leaning than the US. It's
right,
the history
yeah,
of
I
it.
guess it's an American left leaning centrist is where I would sit.
Yeah, you're a liberal Democrat, I'd say, if you
Yeah,
call yourself left
right,
wing. And I'm a liberal Democrat. I'm basically a liberal, but not particularly left wing. But Australia has much better social service, like Canada, much better social services. Uh, Everyone is covered medically, and why Americans don't want this? I think they do want it. They just can't. Nobody's managed to sell it to them. They think it's communism, and communism. Trump is much closer to communism than the liberals, because communism, the really loathsome part of it, is authoritarianism and dictatorship, and the guy wants to be a dictator.
Yeah, I think the hard part with medicine, and I'm all for socialized medicine. I've just traveled enough of the world to know what it looks like. That it's like I think that's part of the problem is people don't go to these other countries and go, oh, it's actually nice here. It's all hypothetical versus practical. And I think the issue you deal with here is there's so much broken in the things that our government operates that they're just worried there's going to be another thing that's operated corruptly, and that's part of where the resistance I think
Well, I
comes in.
don't, if you look at the private healthcare delivery in the United States, I mean, we working at St Jude, of course, we had private health insurance, so we were just great, and it was great medicine, really great medicine. But if you look at the way that people are being excluded and all sorts of things by private health insurance, I mean, I think the Affordable Care Act has been very popular, and I think that's one of the problems for the Republicans. If they damage that, they're really going to be very unpopular, but they really want to cut Medicaid. And that's the basis of it for many people. It's also the basis of looking after old people. Many old people in retirement homes run out of money, so Medicaid looks after them. And so once that starts to be cut, I think there's going to be enormous backlash and disillusion. But we'll see. I mean, will they have enough sense not to cut it? Trump doesn't want to, I think.
Part of this their policy is to throw crazy statements out there to distract, and then they make small changes in the background. That seems to be so. It's either going to cut Social Security or Medicare. I don't think that's actually what's going to happen, but they're still cutting things that are
Well, they
worrisome.
fire a
So
lot of people. I mean,
yeah,
I believe you can no longer contact Social Security by telephone, for instance. So that's
yeah,
going to compromise a lot of people. You know, a lot of poorer Americans don't actually use computers. I think they
right,
use their phone, but they
yeah,
don't use a computer.
yeah.
So,
I agree.
so that's one of the mistakes the Democrats made. They think they get full penetration through Google and
Yeah,
all that sort of thing, but they don't necessarily, because a lot of people
no.
don't use those things.
So that goes back to what you were saying. So your next step is to potentially do some more research on COVID and
To
write a
read
book
up
on it.
on it and try and put together a story that's that, as far as that's honest and basically makes a record of it, just for ordinary people who want to look at it. Um, I also, through COVID, I wrote a weekly blog called "Setting It Straight," which is on our website, and I wrote 120 of those. That's actually hard work writing 800,000 words a week. Is pretty demanding, actually.
Yeah, that's a lot. No, I want to look at that too because I'm curious. Again, this is so relevant to probably everyone listening. I don't know that there's anyone in the world that COVID's not relevant to, and I don't think that we still have clarity in hindsight of where are we. What you mentioned
No,
the
no,
spike protein
there's
of the
still a
vaccine.
lot. There's
Yeah,
still a lot that's unclear. People focus so much on the virus origins. I mean, it could have escaped from a lab. I think probably came out of nature, but it could have got out of a lab recently isolated virus. Doesn't look as though it's been manipulated by anyone for any bad purpose or anything like that. Or uh, not my field, but that's what I understand from the virologists. Why we focus so much on that is because we wanted to blame someone. So, and I think we just should forget about blaming people and just trying to get it right.
well, and I don't think there was anything nefarious. That's the problem. Is like let's say it did come out of a lab in China.
I mean, just the usual thing. I mean, I think snafus, situation normal, all fucked up, or basically shit happens, and it does. I mean, it's inevitable.
Last question for me. You've been someone that has achieved some pretty incredible things that it doesn't sound like you had a master plan from, the beginning that you rolled out. What would be your advice to someone that's just starting out that wants to achieve their dreams, that wants to build something great?
Well, listen, I think the American college system is terrific, and it gives you a better time to sort of test a few things and try a few different things that you think you might like. I mean, and not going to college can be terrific too. I mean, if you get yourself skills, I think getting skills is great, and being able to do something that's useful is always great. Some of us are going to be writers and stuff, but I mean, the whole social media landscape is so new, and that's younger people are the people to ask about that. I finally I got through COVID. I got up to about 112,000 followers on Twitter.
Nice. Awesome.
Then it became X, and Twitter was great because scientists were exchanging information, and you get, say, an obstetrician to go on and have a whole long thread on the importance of vaccines and what's happening with babies and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, you learn a lot very quickly. All those people went off it eventually with X, and I just I finally cancelled my X account on Monday because
Wow.
I just couldn't stand the abuse. I mean, it's a horrible,
Yeah.
horrible site. And, you know, we can all decide to be stupid and we can all decide to be smart. But one good piece of advice is avoid stupid people.
Yeah, there's a lot of good cliches about that.
Yeah,
So
that's one piece. The other advice I think is if you can find something you're passionate about and go for it, and be a finisher. That's a problem for a lot of people. You know,
yeah,
close it out. You know,
see it through.
finish it. Get it to a satisfactory conclusion. It may not be the conclusion you wanted. It may not be the best conclusion, but finish it and then move on.
Love that. That is great advice. I think a lot of people need to hear that. Well, Peter, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for coming on Hawk Talk.
Thanks, Eric. Good
Of
chat.
course.
Thank you very much.